Today, the message is a history lesson, part 1, the parting of the ways. This helps to give us some idea of why, in the first century and second, that Christianity sprouted off from the Judean practice of the halakha, the way, and perhaps a little bit about how it might come together even in our time. The text is from the Gospel of Thomas, 72. It's the best text I could find for this particular message. Someone said to Yahshua, "Speak to my brothers, that they may divide my father's possessions with me." Yahshua said to them, "Oh man, who made me a divider?" He turned to his disciples and asked them, "I am not a divider, am I?" An oxymoron is a figure of speech in which contradictory terms appear in conjunction, appear together. I suspect that when I use the expression Jewish Christian, most religious people today hear that as an oxymoron. With such a contemporary break in traditions and religions, how can anyone be a follower of Moshe, who people suppose was a Jew, and Yahshua, who people suppose was a Christian? Each term and religion is seen to be exclusive of the other. Yet at the beginning of the Christian Messianic movement, in the first 100 years after the resurrection, encounters with so-called Jewish Christians, as distinguished from Gentile Christians, happened every day, both in the Holy Land and in the rest of the Roman world. During his days of preaching, Yahshua of Nazareth addressed only Israelites, who we suppose were Jews, the lost sheep of Israel. His disciples were expressly instructed not to approach Gentiles or Samaritans. On the few occasions that Yahshua ventured beyond Israel, and there weren't many, he didn't proclaim the good news, nor to our knowledge did his disciples during his lifetime. The mission of the apostles to all the nations is a later addition to the words of Messiah and appears to be of Pauline inspiration. It's nowhere found in the Gospels except from the longer ending of Mark, which is missing from all the best manuscripts. Yahshua's own perspective was exclusively Jewish. He was concerned only with his own kind. From the Acts, we learn that the primitive Jewish Christian community consisted of 120 core people, including the known apostles, that is, except Paul, and even the mother and brothers of Yahshua. This is the last reference, that is Acts 1, to Maria or Mary in the New Testament, though there are further references to Yahshua's brothers in Acts and in Paul's letters. Yaakov, or James, the brother, is the leader of the Jerusalem assembly, and the married brothers of Yahshua are missionaries traveling. At the feast of Pentecost that followed the crucifixion, Kepha, Peter, and the rest of the apostles were changed by the divine spirit from a group of gutless fugitives to born-again champions of faith in Yahshua. Their proclamation to the Jerusalem crowds increased the original nucleus of 120 by 3,000 new Jewish converts from all over the Roman world. All the converts were asked to do at that time was to believe in Yahshua and to be baptized in his name. They were to be discipled later by appointed overseers and teachers, primarily in the synagogues. The members of the Jerusalem assembly didn't call themselves by any specific name. Their religious movement was known primarily as just the Way, as was the Essenes. Only at a later date, when their establishment in Antioch, do we encounter the name Christianoi, which was applied to them probably as an insult, that is, people who are smeared. We are told by the church that they also called themselves Nazarenes or even Yahshuans. How did the original Jewish Christians compare to their Jewish neighbors? In most ways, they didn't differ at all. Those we call Jewish Christian today considered themselves to still be Jews. Their outward behavior and dietary customs were Jewish, and they continued to faithfully observe all the regulations of the Torah. The apostles and their followers continued to frequent the temple steps for worship. They even performed healing meetings there. The entire party assembled there for prayer every day. Even Paul, the chief opponent of the Torah customs, turned to the temple in his visitations to Jerusalem, outside of which he was nearly murdered. In addition to practicing the law of Moses, the first Jewish Christians also broke bread. That is, they had a real meal. It had the double purpose of feeding them and uniting them with one another, with Yahshua, and with Elohim. This is why they might have called themselves Yahadi, meaning people together as one. The frequency of the meal was daily, like the sacred dinner of the Essenes mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they partook of food with glad and generous heart. Acts 2:46. It appears from early witnesses that the meal began to be held on the first day of the week after the Sabbath was over, thus reserving the Sabbath for worship and rest. The Jerusalem Jewish Christians also practiced theocratic communism. Don't think of Marxism with the name communism. They were not obligated to divest themselves of property and goods, as was the case with the initiated Essenes at Qumran, though moral pressure was imposed that they should divest. Prior to Gentile conversions efforts, the Way appeared to ordinary people as a purely Jewish movement or sect. Like the Essenes, and probably with them, they put on the daily meal and subsisted from a common treasury. In the late 50s, they were referred to as the heresy of the Nazarenes. That's Acts 24:5 and 14. In later Gentile literature, the Judeo-Christians were also called the poor, or Ebionites. Up to the Second Jewish Revolt, all 13 bishops of Jerusalem, starting with James the brother, came from the circumcision party, and they were thoroughly Jewish until the time of Hadrian, when all that stopped. Regarding Gentiles, Acts tells us that around 40 of the household of a Roman centurion, Cornelius, came into the faith in Caesarea. Names, I believe, in Luke Acts have been changed to protect the innocent. In the Cornelius episode of Acts 10, the Pentecost-like ecstasy of the Roman centurion and his entourage persuaded the astonished Kepha to baptize them without further ado. This, however, seems to have been an exceptional event. No further conversion of a Gentile is recorded in the Holy Land anywhere in the New Testament. Later came the Gentile members of the mixed Jewish-Greek church in Antioch, as well as the many pagan converts of Paul in Syria, Asia Minor, and Greece, though Paul wasn't the only evangelist to the Gentiles out there. He is just one of the few we know about. There were certainly many. With them, the Jewish monopoly in the new movement came to an end. Jewish and Gentile Christianity was born. It was in the Syrian city of Antioch in the late 40s that immigrant members of the Jerusalem Kahal were joined there by Gentiles, evangelized and baptized by Jewish Christians originating from Cyprus and Cyrene. James in Jerusalem dispatched Barnabas to run the new mixed community, and Barnabas hurried to Tarsus to persuade Paul, already a believer in Messiah, to join him in overseeing the new assembly. The Jewish and the Gentile Christians of Antioch coexisted well and even took meals together, so we read in the Acts of the Apostles. When visiting the Antioch community, Kepha participated in their common meals. However, when some extra zealous representatives of James, the brother, and the Jerusalem synagogue arrived in Antioch, their disproving attitude compelled the Jewish Christians, including even Kepha and Barnabas, but with the exception of Paul, to quit table fellowship with the unbaptized of the Greek believers present. As a result, harmony in the new mixed assembly was broken. An outraged Paul confronted Kepha and publicly called him a hypocrite, creating the first major row in Christendom. We read in the Nazarene Acts why table fellowship was broken, because the unbaptized of any origin were considered as yet unclean until they had ascended to deliverance and baptism. Did Kepha not know whether the Antioch converts had been baptized or not? Perhaps he and Barnabas found out that they weren't. With such new knowledge, they had no choice but to withdraw, for they had become unclean for the day, according to the judgment from Jerusalem. After Paul's first journey to Asia, the entry of pagans into the way became a particularly thorny issue. Can you imagine why? The Nazarene Acts again explains it. So a council was convened in Jerusalem and attended by James the brother, Kepha, Barnabas, and Paul, at which the extremist Torah party was partially overruled, for James, who was the Nasi, or prince, proposed a compromise. Gentiles wishing to join the way would be exempted from the full rigor of the Torah until they learned the requirements of it. He then required the Gentiles to take an ongoing class on Torah in the synagogue on Sabbath. Yet immediately, the converts were required to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from eating meat of unknown origin, and from certain sex acts that were unconscionable. In the meantime, they could learn the meanings and origins of the other required Torah regulations in their synagogue class and comply as the Spirit continued to circumcise their hearts. Now, these rules were necessarily intended for Gentile converts in the Roman world. In Jerusalem, there were different conditions revolving around the temple. To bring Gentiles onto the steps of the temple, though not forbidden, would cause an uproar of the zealot parties who believed that the presence of Gentiles would render the holy place unclean, even though the court of the nations was provided for all people. To bring Gentiles in would certainly cause a riot and maybe even loss of life. The Jerusalem Council of the Apostles marked the beginning of the separate development of Jewish and Gentile Christianity. They both agreed on some essentials while ardently expecting the impending second coming of Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the inauguration of the kingdom of Elohim. Paul himself insisted that it would happen in his own lifetime. Yahshua predicted it would happen within 40 years of his speech of about 30 AD. John the Revelator insisted that it was his time, it was happening. All those beliefs Jews and Gentile believers had in common. But in other respects, they saw things differently. The original Jewish Christian baptism, which was a rite of purification, and the breaking of the bread, which was a solemn communal meal, were transformed in the Gentile assembly under the influence of Paul. Baptism developed into a participation in the death, burial, and resurrection of Yahshua. The communal meal became a holy reiteration of the Last Supper. The perceived differences soon led to animosity and to an increasing anti-Jewish opinion in the Gentile assembly, and vice versa, not unlike the Protestant toleration of Catholicism today. Sometime soon after the fall of Jerusalem, the synagogues added a new prayer to their benedictions, a prayer against Jewish Christians, the Birkat HaMinim. It was prayed at the end of every meeting, and it went like this, according to one that was found in the Cairo Geniza. Listen. For the apostates, let there be no hope, and let the arrogant government be speedily uprooted in our days. Let the Nazarene and the Minim be destroyed in a moment, and let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be inscribed together with the righteous. You are blessed, O Adonai, who humbles the arrogant. Obviously, this prayer was designed to root out the believers in Yahshua who attended the synagogue to learn the Torah of Moses, which James commanded them to keep. If you attended the church that cursed your family every meeting, you probably wouldn't stay there very long. And the Yahshuans were labeled heretics, minim, notzrim, and put out as though they were no longer Jews at all. On the other hand, John the Revelator warned believers of the Jewish type to beware of the apostates who claimed to be Jews but were not. Undoubtedly, he's talking about the Gentile believers who thought and taught that the church had inherited the blessings of Elohim that the Jews had lost. We call this supersessionism or replacement theology, which is still a major doctrine in most churches yet today. The Jews, the Israelites, lost the blessing, whereas the Gentiles gained it. The Jews lose, we win. Two of the oldest ancient Jewish Christian writings that survive today offer some insight into the divergences between the two branches of the followers of Yahshua. The Didache, or the teaching of the 12 apostles, not to be confused with the Gospel of the Holy 12, is our last major Jewish Christian document preserved in full. Second, the Epistle of Barnabas is one of the earliest expressions of a more accepting Christianity, bearing slight alternatives to some Jewish restrictions. At first, the Didache, D-I-D-A-C-H-E. The Didache is assigned to the second half of the first century, and earlier than some of the New Testament, maybe all. It may well come from the apostles themselves and or the brothers of Yahshua. That's what I believe. Its religious program is a summary of the Torah, the love of Elohim and of neighbor, and an inversion and possibly earlier version of the Golden Rule. Whatever you don't want to happen to you, don't do to another. The lifestyle of the Didache is that of the earliest communion and community of the way, including theocratic communism. Share all things with your brother and don't say that anything is your own, the text says. The Didache recommends the observance of the entire Mosaic law, or at least for believers to do the best you can. Baptism is presented as a rite of purification. A spray of water may be substituted if no pools or rivers are available. Communal prayer entailed the recitation of Our Father in the Sky 3 times a day, what we call the Lord's Prayer. The Sabbath was to be kept, and the Thanksgiving meal was celebrated on what may have been Sunday. It was probably a real dinner as well as a symbolic spiritual food. The Didache's version of the communion liturgy has nothing in common with that which is found in the New Testament. The Didache is far more down-to-earth, primitive, and Jewish. The Didache's teaching authority is in the hands of itinerant prophets who originated in Jerusalem. Assemblies were managed by the equivalent of overseers and servants. However, these were not appointed, but democratically elected by the community as time went on. Perhaps the most significant element of the Didache's doctrine concerns its understanding of the person of Yahshua. Therein are none of the theological ideas of Paul about Yahshua in the role of Redeemer or the divine Logos. He's never called the Son of God. As amazing as it may seem, Son of God is found only once. It's the self-designation of the Antichrist, the seducer of the world. The only title assigned to Yahshua in this Jewish Christian book is the Greek term pais, which means servant or even child. But since in the Didache, David is called the pais, it becomes clear that we must render it servant rather than child, the servant of Elohim. The Didache uses only the most primitive, earliest, and lowliest qualifications about Yahshua. In short, the Yahshua of the Didache is a great teacher of the end of sin, who is expected to reappear soon to gather his elect and transfer them to the kingdom of Elohim, he as the Son of Man. As handed down by Jewish teachers to Jewish listeners, the image of Yahshua remained close to the earliest tradition underlying the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. And the believing congregation resembled the Jerusalem assembly portrayed in Acts and Nazarene Acts. As the Didache is the earliest Jewish Christian texts that we probably have, we in the Yahad consider it as scripture, and we follow the ways it sets out for us. Later, there was an evolution. Yahshua seems to go from charismatic prophet to superhuman. This change coincided with the geographical and religious transformation when the preaching of the gospel moved from the Jewish culture to the pagan, mystical, Greco-Roman world. Under the influence of Paul's genius, the assembly acquired a hierarchical structure governed by bishops, presbyters, and deacons. The disappearance of the Jewish influence opened the way to a gentilization and de-Judaization, even toward anti-Judaization, which we may see exposed by the earliest work of Gentile Christianity, the second of our primitive letters today, that is, the letter of Barnabas. The letter attributed to Barnabas is thought to be a work of Gentile Christian author. It was most likely written in the soon after the fall of Jerusalem and almost made its way into the sacred books, but considered too Jewish to be put into the fledgling New Testament. It's included in the oldest New Testament codex, that is the Codex Sinaiticus, but was finally declared non-canonical by the Church. It's a work in which moral instructions based on common Jewish ideas of the way of light and the way of darkness, found also in the Didache and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The author depicts two quarreling parties, designated simply as we and they. The first, perhaps, representing the Gentiles, and the second, the Jews. The dispute seems to be founded on passages in the Septuagint, that is the Greek Old Testament, which Each faction had their own interpretations. Barnabas instructed his readers in complete knowledge by showing them the essential meanings of the biblical nature of covenant, the temple, sacrifice, circumcision, Sabbath, and food ordinances. He insists that the institutions and precepts of the Old Testament may be interpreted allegorically as well as literally. In fact, the laws of Moses have been spiritualized in the new understanding revealed by Yahshua. Sacrifice should no longer amount to only slaughter, but demands a broken heart. Nor is forgiveness of sin obtained through the sacrifice of animals, but through the sprinkling of the blood of Messiah. The ideas found in Paul, ignored or unknown by the author of the Didache, are, in Barnabas' thought, quite similar. According to him, those endowed with perfect knowledge understand that the favor of the true circumcision of the heart is dispensed not by the mutilation of flesh, but by means of Yahshua, the final sacrifice. Barnabas is working hard through his letter to gather all believers in Yahshua in the wake of the destruction of Israel by the Romans. He finds himself still alive at that time, and the sheep scattered all over the place. Many thousands, if not tens of thousands, taken away by the Romans to Europe. For Barnabas, the covenant between Elohim and the Jews was abandoned in then the Savior's sacrifice. When Moses saw that the Jews were inscribed by Elohim's hand, and now Jerusalem and the temple were crushed to demonstrate that is in Moses' day, his day had seen the entire establishment destroyed rather than saved by Elohim. It had been replaced by the redemptive blood of beloved Yahshua in the heart of believers. Barnabas' portrait of Yahshua is more advanced than the Didache's servant of Elohim. Barnabas calls Yahshua the Son, or Son of Elohim, no fewer than a dozen times. This Son of Elohim had existed since all eternity and was active in the creation. It was to this pre-existent Yahshua that at the time of the foundation of the world, Elohim addressed the words, "Let us make man according to our image and likeness." That is, just like the first Adam. The divine character of Yahshua is implied when Barnabas explains that the Son of Elohim took on a human body, because without such a disguise, no one would have been able to look at him and stay alive. The ultimate purpose of the descent of the master of the world among men was to enable himself to suffer in order to destroy death and show that there is a resurrection. Hallelujah. In the later part of Barnabas, it's complete with Torah obligations, some of which were of a different source than the biblical books. About the last third of Barnabas is reminding those who read his book about the prescriptions of the Torah and what good they will do for you. Now, this little higher opinion of Yahshua may have caused a crack between the sects of the Nazarenes and Ebionites. For the Ebionites retained the belief that Yahshua was only a great teacher and a moral example, that the sacrifices were an abomination, that the blood of Yahshua could never clean anything, and that no supernaturalism could be tolerated. And we see such beliefs in those who call themselves Ebionite today. It is sad to see. It is a shipwreck of faith. The parting of the ways between Jewish and Gentile Christianity is starting to manifest at this stage, and the Epistle of Barnabas, taken to an extreme, may have sparked the future doctrinal evolution of the church on exclusively Gentile lines. though it seems to me that Paul's theology was already surpassing Barnabas in supernaturalism and mysticism, which I see in its fullest in Galatians 2:20, which you may want to look up again. Read it with new eyes and see what you think. A century and a half after Barnabas, Melito, the bishop of Sardis, declared that the Jews are guilty of deicide. God has been murdered by the right hand of Israel, he said. To the church, Jewish Christianity made sense no longer and should be rooted out and destroyed. It appears that the Didache was the last great flowering of Jewish Christianity. After Hadrian destroyed Jerusalem again in 135, changed its name, and no longer permitted Jews to live there, the decline of Jewish Christianity began. Justin Martyr proudly notes that in his day, non-Jews greatly outnumbered Jewish members of the church. Thereafter, Jewish Christianity, the elder sister, adhering to the observance of the Mosaic precepts and combining them with the primitive type of faith in Yahshua, progressively became a fringe movement. Jewish Christians progressively vanished, either rejoining the Jewish fold or being absorbed into the Gentile church. But on our day and generation, we are experiencing something of a resurgence of Jewish Christianity that started about the same time as the charismatic Catholic movement, around 1967, the year Jerusalem became Jewish again, if I am not mistaken. You and I and perhaps thousands of believers have left the church in order to found small groups of Messianic Jewish-style believers, the most of whom seem to be ex-Gentiles who have been called back to a simpler and somewhat more or less religious halakha that is much more like the way than anything else has been down through the ages. New books have burrowed their way out of the ground. The Dead Sea Scrolls teachings, which maintain a discipline very, very much like Jewish Christianity, and in many ways has fascinated the world now for 75 years. The Didache, which was only discovered 125 years ago, has been published again and again through the great world presses and been made available to anyone who wants it free of charge, albeit in old churchy translations. That's why I decided to reinterpret it from the Greek so that we could see it in its full Hebrew context. The Epistle of Barnabas, the same. While the Bible has become more and more distantly readable through the hundreds of translations, watering down of the mystifying of the teachings therein, still now there are versions that re-emphasize the Jewishness of the books therein. That is a wonderful thing. And like a needle in a haystack, they're not easy to find, but they can be found. And at least they can be found if you look. Perhaps thousands of small groups have found their own way in this present decadent world who are recovering the didactics of ancient days and all over the world. And yes, we would like to see them all together in at least a cooperating alliance. And we've talked about this in the Yahad. But as yet, that has not been the case and doesn't look like it will be for the future. Each is still as independent as can be. But just maybe that is the plan of our master and head. Though on him we may be one, and in him we may be one, in this world we may still need to be many. Shall we continue in our mission to bring the many into one? John 17:20 through 26 will be the ending of this message, the first part of the parting of the ways, where Yahshua is quoted as saying these important words, important for them at that time, more important even for us today. I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me, and the glory that you gave me I have given to them, that they may be one just as we are one, I in them and you in me, that they may be made perfect, complete in one, and that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them as you have loved me. O Father, I desire that they also, whom you gave me, may be with me where I am, that they may behold my glory that you have given me, for you loved me before the foundation of the world. O righteous Father, the world has not known you, but I have known you, and these have known that you sent me. And I have declared to them your name, and will declare it, that the love with which you love me may be in them, and I in them. Amen.